Hi, so today we're going to talk about food chains, pyramids, and interactions. So our objectives for today are: what are food chains? Pyramids. What are food chains and pyramids? We're also going to look at how does energy flow, and lastly we're going to look about how do organisms interact. So this is directly related to our activity that we did last week, but today we're going to look at specific interactions. So how do organisms interact? So by the end of today, this is what hopefully you'll be able to get out of today's lecture. So first we'll start off with food chains and different roles that organisms play in their environment. So first we'll start off with a little bit of vocab. We know an autotroph and a producer. These are the same thing. These are people who, not necessarily people, but organisms who make their own food. And remember, they do that through a process called photosynthesis. We're also looking at consumers. Consumers are things that consume or eat other organisms. And within that we have three categories. So for our vocab we have herbivores, we have omnivores, and we have carnivores. So herbivore, herb meaning plant, eaters, carnivores meaning meat eaters, and lastly we have omnivores that eat both plants and meat. So that's just a little bit of context, a couple of vocabulary words that you might want to know for a test that would give you some feedback on what roles that organisms can play in a food chain. So now for some rules of a food chain. We know that in a food chain there are a couple rules we follow. We know that arrows follow the energy. Food chains are limited by energy. And they always start with the producer and move to a consumer. They're also linear, and they only show one relationship. So what are some examples of food chains? One example might be, for example, grass gets eaten by a cow, which is eaten by a human. That's one example of food chain. The arrows follow the energy. The energy is moved from the grass to the cow to the human. It's limited by eventually the human is known as a top consumer. And eventually there's not enough energy to keep going, so we stop. We also move from a producer to a consumer, and it shows one relationship. One relationship from a grass to a cow, one relationship from a cow to a human. Next we'll talk about food webs. Food webs show multiple food chains and multiple interactions. So these are similar to chains, but we see multiple things going on. So if we start with our grass, previous example of a grass to a cow to human, we can add other levels. For example, humans can also eat the grass. Cows can also eat wheat. Grass can also be eaten by horses. So we've added a whole new level of complexity by adding in other things that the cow can eat. So we see two relationships, and other things humans can eat, so just things like fruit. Making humans an omnivore, cows continue to be herbivores, as do horses, and we can also add in other organisms, such as wolves. So you can see there's multiple food chains in existence to get a food web. Now we're going to talk about food pyramids. Food pyramids are different in that they show food chains, but they don't necessarily show multiple interactions. Again, they're pyramids, and there are three types of pyramids within that. The first one is biomass. This shows the actual physical weight of the organisms. The amount of energy, we're going to follow something called the 10% rule, which we'll talk about in lab this week. But the 10% rule says that only 10% of energy goes to the next level. So there are things called trophic levels, and a trophic level is each succeeding arrow. So you can think of it as your first, second, and tertiary level, 1, 2, 3, as you're moving up. And lastly, the number of organisms just shows you the relationship between the number of producers to consumers. And these are all related, and what would be some examples of that? Going back to our grass, cow, human example, we'd start with the weight. So for 100 kilograms, let's say, 100 kilograms of grass that can feed 10 kilograms of cow, which would feed 1 kilogram of people. And just for reference, 1 kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. So that shows as we go up the biomass pyramid that less and less biomass is available from the beginning. And of course at the bottom of all these we have more and more. The 10% rule of energy, the unit for energy would be joules. So for example, we could start with 200 joules of energy found in the grass, which now we divide by 10. We have 20 joules of energy in the cow, which would be equivalent to 2 joules of energy in the human. Notice that every time we go up the level, we're dividing by 10. Lastly, for the number of organisms, this relates to how much an ecosystem or an area that has both living and non-living things can support. If we have 100 blades of grass, that can support 10 cows, which could support 1 human. So note, every time we go up, we're always going to divide by 10. Divide by 10. And these are just showing 3 different ways that a food pyramid can show. So far we've covered food pyramids, food chains, and food webs. Lastly, I wanted to just talk about some interactions between organisms. And these are basically how they work together. So some of the interactions you may have touched upon, if you look at the video below, competition. We can see these as predator versus prey. So prey is something that you chase after, it gets eaten, and the predators are hunter. So we have competition. We also have different interactions such as that are called symbiosis. So sim, meaning together, there's different ways that organisms can interact. There's mutualism, which means that things benefit, both benefit. There's parasitism, which I'll include a clip on. Parasitism has to do with one benefit, one harm. And lastly, there's commensalism, which is basically a neutral example between 2 organisms. So what are some examples of mutualism? An example of mutualism would be, for example, the fish who have the little shrimps that clean their mouth. The little shrimps that clean the mouth of the fish get a food, and the fish that get their teeth clean, and they are healthier. An example of a parasite, these things could be like your ticks, your lice. When anyone says you're a parasite, you're basically doing nothing beneficial. You're harming them. And lastly, commensalism are 2 organisms existing in the same place, not really either one benefiting. It's really important to always have a summary. So in summary today, we found out a couple different things. We know that energy can be shown. Energy can be showcased in chains, webs, and pyramids. We have energy that flows from a producer to consumers. And we also know that there are multiple interactions between organisms, and this includes competition, parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. So those are basically ways that organisms interact within their community. We'll focus this week on these 2, and next week we'll look a little bit about some of the specific interactions in populations or groups of organisms that are the same. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email or send me a text. But these are the big ideas for this week. We're looking at energy, how energy moves through our environment. Hope you had a great day. Take care, and I'll see you in class.